the right way to look at this problem is that identity is a data problem. What I mean by that is because we have so much fragmented data, there is so much context out there. If we can put all of that together in a single data lake, and that's what Andromeda does, ingests all data from all the data sources, IDP, HR systems, cloud providers, most importantly, activity logs. And then once you have everything in a single space, you can run models on top of it. So we run machine learning models around risk scoring or behavioral analysis, peer behavior, your past behavior, and so on. And then all the use cases really come out of that data and the models. So what does Andromeda do? Well, to start with, it gives you visibility. So it discovers all identities, human and non-human, and builds a risk model, a score across posture, behavior, and permissions, and tells you which identities to focus on, which are your high-risk identities, and gives you built-in remediation steps.
This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Not so bad. Yourself?
Happy 2025. This is our first Sponsor Spotlight episodes of the year.
It is. And we're starting off with a bang. Like you mentioned, this is a sponsored episode. So we're very fortunate to have one of the key members of the Andromeda security team here with us. They are, so it's Andromeda Security. You saw that in title as we're rolling this out. They're an AI-powered identity security platform. You can find out more about them at andromedasecurity.com/IDAC. And I mentioned it. We've got one of the co-founders here, co-founder and chief product officer of Andromeda, Ashish Shah. Welcome to the show, Ashish.
Thanks, Jeff and Jim. Really excited to be participating in that. Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us. We definitely appreciate it. We have a lot of stuff going on in the identity space, and I always love to hear origin stories of where did people come from when it comes to their digital identity journey. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you get into the digital identity or IAM space? Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you?
Great question. So most of the founding team at Andromeda came from a company called Avi Networks. Avi was a software load balancer, web application firewall company, founded in 2013, acquired by VMware in 2019. And we saw the journey of our customers at Avi into cloud and SaaS. And we saw identity, especially permissions management, was a key problem that our customers were facing as they moved to cloud. It's very different in what's on-prem versus cloud. So that's where the genesis of the company started. And then as we started looking into the problem space, we saw that there are a lot of unsolved problems out there. There are lots of vendors there, of course, but there are lots of problems out there that are unsolved. And so when we started Andromeda, where we started looking at, okay, what are the top challenges that we have to, that are still unsolved? I think the biggest one that I think all we know about is identity is at the center of attack. No pun intended, but it's a primary attack vector today. It's not if, it's when it'll get compromised. And so the attack surface really is determined by the overprivileges or the permissions that any identity has, human and non-human. So that was the biggest problem we want to solve is, can we get to a state where even if you have a compromise, there is zero or minimal business impact? So that was the first problem we wanted to solve. But there are other day-to-day problems, such as even today, the access management is manual. When somebody joins or leaves or moves, there are manual workflows. And especially in cloud, people don't have patience to wait for hours to get their accesses. Compliance is a pain today, frankly. There's a lot of rubber stamping going on. And all of these issues are relevant for both human and non-human identity. And I'll just leave with one last thing, which is NHI, or non-human identity, has an additional unique problem, especially with the automation and adoption of cloud and DevOps, is discovery. What's out there? So this was the kind of the landscape with which we saw that we realized that this is a problem space that we can It's a hard problem space, but it's a problem space that we can add value to and differentiate. And so that's where we started Andromeda.
Give me some ideas of what the Andromeda platform does, because I'm sure there's a lot of different problems solved. You mentioned NHI or non-human identities. You mentioned the human aspect of things like rubber stamping when it comes to, compliance and access reviews and everyone's favorite, IGA activities and things like that. Tell me a little about the platform. I know we're going to dig a little bit more detail, but give me just kind of a quick high level to whet my appetite.
Sure. So if you were to say a tagline, Andromeda is an identity security platform for both human and non-human identities, right? And the ultimate goal is that we automate your permissions and life cycles of human and non-human based on risk, context, and behavioral analysis, so that even if your identity is compromised, there is minimal to zero business impact, right? That's what we started with. But what does that mean? So before I answer the questions what Andromeda does in detail, let's understand why it's broken today. So if you look at the vendor landscape today, they are very fragmented. There are NHI-only vendors. And then there are, even within human identities, you hear the buzzwords ITDR or ISPM or KIM, JIT, and IGA. I think the right way to look at this problem is that identity is a data problem. What I mean by that is because we have so much fragmented data, there is so much context out there. If we can put all of that together in a single data lake, and that's what Andromeda does, ingests all data from all the data sources, IDP, HR systems, cloud providers, most importantly, activity logs. And then once you have everything in a single space, you can run models on top of it. So we run machine learning models around risk scoring or behavioral analysis, peer behavior, your past behavior, and so on. And then all the use cases really come out of that data and the models. So what does Andromeda do? Well, to start with, it gives you visibility. So it discovers all identities, human and non-human, and builds a risk model, a score across posture, behavior, and permissions, and tells you which identities to focus on, which are your high-risk identities, and gives you built-in remediation steps. So that's step one. Think of that as a journey of your identity security maturity. So start with visibility, recommendations, remediations. The next thing we do is real-time visibility into who has access to what roles and permissions, and more importantly, who's using what, so that you can right-size the roles based on not just usage, but more importantly, risk. Because our theory is that only frequently used permissions that are low risk should be part of somebody's standing privilege. Everything else moves to just-in-time access. So the least privilege is the second set of use cases that we do. That moves us to just-in-time access. There are lots of JIT vendors out there. The way we differentiate in JIT is use context, use behavioral analysis. If Jim requests a privilege role, and if he's always done it, same location, same devices, why ask Jeff, who's going to rubber stamp it anyways? Automatically approve it. Take the human out of the loop when the risk is low. But if Jim is asking for it for the first time, or is in a different location, then add friction, ask Jeff, and tell Jeff what to look for so he can make a more informed decision. That's how we do intelligent JIT. And then the final piece is IGA, user access reviews based on activities, past behavior, and lifecycle management of identity. So it's a platform. And we can go into each of these in detail, but hopefully that gives you an idea around what we do.
I think it's helpful because it really kind of, I guess it spans the galaxy, pardon the pun, on that. There's this concept of being data-driven for an IAM program. When I say program, I mean the way the program itself operates, the people, the process, the governance, et cetera. A lot of organizations are sitting on a treasure trove of data that sits in a system and really never gets used for anything beyond, oh, great, we got a new onboarder, a new joiner, a new leaver, things like that. Mm-hmm. I feel like there's so much more that could be done with that data, especially if you're able to contextualize it, bring it into the system, and then combine it with automation and say, oh, okay, because X, here's what's going to happen, Y, right? And or else Z, right? Whatever that looks, or that pseudo logic looks like. So I love this idea of it. I want to let Jim ask some questions instead of me hogging all the time, but I've got one last question before I turn it over to Jim. How do people measure success with Andromeda? Because it feels like there's a lot of different ways it could be done, but I'd love to hear it straight from you.
Yeah, excellent question. So customers buy a solution to solve a problem. They don't buy a platform, right? We have a platform doesn't mean we sell a platform, right? We sell use cases. So we meet our customers in whichever step of their journey they are in, right? So we have customers who are in the early stage of the journey where, well, I don't have visibility into how many identities are there and who are the risky ones, especially the NHI side, right? And the other extreme of the maturity curve is, well, I am implementing JIT. I need something that is automated based on intelligence and context, and everything in between, from role right sizing to least privilege or access reviews and so on. So we meet our customers based on the current pain points, help them solve those pain points better than anybody else. And once that's done, then expand into a second use case and third use case. So success is frankly measured by, well, what is the current problem statement that you're trying to solve? How can we help you do that? Let's take an example for just-in-time access. Well, there's a customer who decided to deploy JIT, and they look at multiple vendors and decided on Andromeda. So let's operationalize that in a phased manner. Let's make sure JIT is deployed. Once that hits a certain maturity curve, let's look at, for example, NHI use case and so on. And we have a different customer who says, I'll get to JIT in future. I want to first solve my NHI use case. Let's start there, right? And then go on. So that's how we measure success based on the specific use case the customers wants to deploy in, and then land and expand.
So Ashish, were tremendously popular. Your booth was popular at Identiverse, at Gartner, which was the most recent one we saw. Yeah, and Jeff and I are regulars at those conferences every year. You were hard to get much more than a handshake from, but you had a lot of people who wanted to hear your story, understand what is it that you guys bring to the table. Here's my perspective, is that as customers, we want to put everyone in a box. We want to be able to relate that to something we understand. And when we have budget line items as practitioners, we have a budget for IGA replacement or IDP replacement. Where does Andromeda fit? What's the closest bucket? Is it IGA? Is it privileged access management? Is it ITDR, KEEM? You tell me. If somebody's going out and saying, I've got money for IGA, is Andromeda on that list?
Great question, Jim. And I understand totally how we all like to bucket solutions, right? Because it simplifies how we think about it, right? Because there's so many vendors out there, and you need a structured way to bucket these and say, okay, this is this category and this is that category. So it's a fair question. We like to flip the question slightly and say, okay, what is the current problem you're trying to solve? Okay, you're trying to solve an IGA problem. Does Andromeda have a solution in IGA? Yes, it does. You are trying to solve a JIT use case. So I'm looking for a JIT vendor. Does Andromeda fit into that category? The answer is yes, and so on. So rather than putting Andromeda in one bucket, we like to think that we are a platform that spans multiple use cases across multiple of these buckets. And depending on what is the current pain point, as I mentioned earlier, we would be able to, if we are able to address that, then the customers would buy that. So that's why we look at it. The reason this is an important distinction is that because of these bucketed vendors, we have this fragmented landscape. And we think that the right way to do that is put everything in a single data lake and build models on that. Let me give you a specific example. One of the most common things today you see is lots of NHI vendors, which is great. And I'm sure we'll talk more about NHI later on this podcast. But our contention is that NHI itself cannot be solved in isolation. I'll give you two reasons. The risks of NHIs and the corresponding human users are intertwined, and their life cycles are intertwined. If I left the organization, all the NHIs that I managed or owned or used have to be either deleted if they're no longer in use, or rekeyed and reassigned to somebody else. Otherwise, there is a latent risk of that NHI by the now exited employee. So the life cycles are intertwined. Same thing around the risk, right? And a risk of a human user is not just identified by the roles and the access to the application that he or she has, but also the relevant roles and permissions of all the NHIs that he or she is managing, right? And finally, I would say that other than the discovery component of NHI, which is unique because human identities have a directory service and HR systems, NHIs don't. Other than that, the permissions management, the governance, the privilege access management are common to both human and non-human. So why have separated solutions when you're trying to solve the same kind of problems? So that's why we don't like to bucket ourselves that we are IGA or PIM or PAM or KIM or so on. We like to say, what is the use case you're trying to solve? Let us show you whether we can address that better than anybody else. And then if so, you can use Andromeda.
Okay, that's a really cool perspective. So let me ask the question then, what is the ideal customer type? Because I work with some clients who are mature or were very mature at one time, and they kind of reached some of the sticking points with the technology solutions they have. They can't take on some of these newer use cases that are presented from cloud environments, or maybe their scale has grown. I also work with clients who, they really just haven't invested in IAM in the past decade. And so they're more or less a greenfield. Even if they have an IGA solution, it might not be one that, people commonly talk about it anymore. It might be that old, right? So what is the ideal client who comes to you? Is it the savvy client, or is the client who's just getting their feet wet, or maybe it's a savvy practitioner who took a job and it's, like I said, greenfield?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll answer it with two perspectives. What is the ultimate vision? But as a startup, what is the current focus, right? Because at the end of the day, it's a matter of physics, right? So as a startup, to be successful, you have to make sure that you are addressing the use cases in the right order and not trying to boil the ocean. So let's start with what we support today and what our ideal customer today looks like. Our ideal customer today is anybody who's trying to solve an identity security problem for cloud and SaaS. And whether and in each of the buckets that we talked about, whether it's around visibility and risk scoring of your identities, human or non-human, it's around least privilege, it's around just-in-time access in cloud, or IGA for cloud and SaaS. So in any of these buckets, if you're focused on your cloud and SaaS environment, that's our ideal customer today. We do not have an on-prem solution today, and so that's the current focus. But segueing into where we are going, well, absolutely, we will scale into on-premises as well, and that's a longer term story as we mature our product, our integrations, and so on. And so our vision is to be able to be the identity security platform across human and non-human, based on risk and context and behavioral analysis across all of the use cases we talked about. Cloud, SaaS, on-prem. Today, it's cloud and SaaS.
You mentioned non-human identities, said maybe we'll get it. Yeah, we're definitely going to get to that. Your website screams human and non-human. But I would say 2024 was the year that we woke up and said, oh, these non-human identities, they're a problem that we should deal with. I've been in identity for over 20 years. It's been there the whole time. The problem has been there, but now everybody's talking about it. Maybe 2025 is going to be the year that, all heck breaks loose. But my question to you, Ashish, is why now? Why is it that everyone's waking up to this problem now?
It's a great question. You're right. I think my thesis there is that we hit that that maturity curve. We hit that inflection point of NHI usage. So if you think about it, NHIs were there. It's not that the machine identities or NHIs were not there on premises, right? It's that the cloud and SaaS has increased the use of automation, DevOps, and that has proliferated the use of NHIs. And I think we try to bucket ourselves, or we try to bucket NHIs into all NHIs are equal. They are not. They're different kinds of NHIs, from service accounts to API keys, tokens, to even AD credentials used for on premises, right? So I think
That's a podcast of its own. We just said that, right?
yes, that's right. That's right. But the reason I think the NHIs has taken up is because I think we've hit that inflection point where the adoption of DevOps and cloud and automation has gone to a point where it's become a serious problem. And the one of the biggest challenges with NHIs that I think we referenced earlier is there is no single source of truth. There is no directory service or an IDP equivalent for NHIs. And so I think it's even a harder problem because you can't gate all NHIs through a single funnel like we can do through SSO and MFA for human users and look at HR as a single source of truth. So I think that's the reason why all of these things coming together, we are seeing a lot of focus on NHI.
Yeah. And, I feel like we are now experts in managing human identity, right? I mean, it's kind of boiled down to it's simple, Simon. There's an authoritative source, normally the HR system for who works here. Maybe there's a contractor database. And then we have a IGA system and a spits out access. It's really these NHIs that they're hard to manage. And with kind of what you were describing earlier, sounds like you went right after the problem. You took on the hard stuff. But what makes it so hard to manage these?
Yeah. I'll answer the questions, but I would also contend to your point that HI is a solved problem or human identity is a solved problem. I don't think so. It's not a solved problem because it's all manual and not really based on context. I think the IGAs today are just mostly rubber stamps. All the roles are over provisioned, like 95% of roles are over provisioned, even for human users. So I don't think it's a solved problem, but let's park that for a second. Let's come back to an NHI question, which is what makes the NHI hard? So let's start with what are the aspects of NHI security that are relevant. I think we all focus on the first one, which is discovery, credentials management, lifecycle management. I like to put all that under the roughly authentication bucket, which is, okay, what are all the NHIs? So do discovery, because there is no central place. What are the key rotation or credential rotation hygiene? How often should we rotate them? And how should we recycle them when somebody with the NHI is deleted or the passwords are rotated or keys are rotated and so on. That's where most of the vendors are focused on. It's an important problem, but that's not the only problem. There are two other aspects of NHIs that are often overlooked. The next one being the permissions management, the role right sizing. Because just like human users, NHI has a role and a set of permissions. And if they're overprivileged, you have a large attack surface. In fact, I would argue that there are types of NHIs where key management is irrelevant. I'll give an example. Think of AWS EC2, a VM. A VM has an inherent EC2 instance profile. It's a temporary credential that AWS manages on your behalf. You as an enterprise don't have to worry about key rotations for these kind of workload identities. However, you absolutely have to worry about the roles it's assigned, because if that VM is compromised, the attacker can assume the role that workload identity is able to take. And if it has additional excessive privileges, all hell can break loose. So the permissions, the role right sizing parts of NHI is equally important, in some cases more important than the credential piece for certain kinds of identities. That's what makes it hard. The final piece I will talk about, a third type of security, is securing the client. Let me give an example. Let's say let's focus on AWS. You have a role I'm an enterprise. In my enterprise account, I have an AWS role. I'm trusted a third party. It's another SaaS service. Their AWS role in their account. And there is a client applications that's using the role to access my my enterprise role. There is no credential exchange here. It's a role-to-role trust. What should you protect? Two things: the permissions in the role so that there is no excessive privilege, and the client application, the third-party applications, which is using the role. So protecting the client itself. We often overlook this component, this part of NHS security as well. So I think we're still in our early phases of NHS security. There are multiple aspects. We all focus on one, but there are many things, many hidden dimensions to NHS security, and that's what makes it hard.
Good answer. And I want to come back for the follow-up on number 2, but this was a triggered question. So bonus question. I ask this one a lot. Jeff and I don't agree on the answer. Is there a nuance between non-human identity and non-human account, or do they basically mean the same thing?
It is a tricky question because account word is so overloaded, right? An AWS account is an Azure subscription, is a GCP project, right? Where traditionally account means an identity. So we think of account and identity almost synonymously because the way to think about it is that does it have a set of permissions, roles, which allows it to do something, then you need to worry about as an identity. And I think if you apply those first principles, then you can think that NHI and the non-human account are equivalent.
I was kind of thinking of the term account in terms of, the kind of the traditional sense of a username and password kind of thing, not so much the AWS account. But I kind of feel like there's a future, and I don't want to take us too far off track, a future where you have AI worker robots, and they can make security decisions on whether or not accounts. I'm using the term accounts again. Should have the permissions that they have. I can basically make decisions like people. So that is an area where a non-human, to me, would be an identity. I digress.
Well, I want to get to this because we definitely don't agree on this one, and that's fine, right? We're exchanging ideas here. Where does account stop and identity begin, and vice versa? I think that's really kind of the crux of the question is, you have an identity, I have an identity. We also have accounts. Can a non-human also have an identity because it also has accounts? Or maybe it's its own entity, right? Or whatever we want to call it. Jim, in your example, a worker bot, right? Or AI bot or chat bot or whatever it may be, there's going to come the point where you're going to effectively hire AI workers to do things. Do they have their own identity because they have account? I don't know, right? I think that it's an interesting discussion in my mind because it's very semantic and almost kind of like philosophical.
So we have a perspective on. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think we should have an episode and tap into smart people like Ashish to answer that question in under 3 minutes, and then kind of like we did with IAM versus digital identity, what's the difference? And make an episode out of that.
Yeah. So if I may add one thing, we actually see some of the practical implications on this even today. So for example, I'm Ashish, but I'm logging into AWS through SSO. Okay. So that's an identity, right? But I might also have a local break glass account within an AWS account. Is it the same Ashish? Or is it a different account? What we do is we put all of that under a hierarchical umbrella. We call it I'm looking for the right word here. It's an instance, or it's an incarnation. So Ashish is the ultimate identity. Ashish has multiple incarnations. One is an SSO incarnation. One is a break glass incarnation. That helps us because you can use the incarnation when it makes sense. Like who logged in? The specific incarnation logged in. Who does it belong to? It belongs to Ashish. So you can answer these questions depending on what you're trying to. You can get to the right answers based on what you're looking for. Similarly to an AI bot question, the AI bot can be an NHI itself, with its own incarnations, but the ownership is Ashish's because Ashish manages it. So you can do a combination of human and non-human ownership relationship, and within the identities incarnation notion, where it's just one identity, but it has multiple accounts, multiple incarnations, depending on which system it's used in. That helps us in general. But it's a larger conversation.
It is, and I feel so semantic around this, right? Because you're right. We use accounts, we use identities, we use IAM to mean a whole bunch of different things that probably shouldn't. And words matter, especially when you're talking to people. And make sure you have you're using the same language, the same definitions of those types of things. But I'm gonna lay my infinity gauntlet down here, and I'm gonna drop the mic on Jim real quick. We don't call it non-human accounts. We've been calling it this entire conversation human identities and non-human identities. So there you go, Jim. That's my comeback.
If you came to work at my company, you, Jeff Stedman, and I gave you, here's your login for your email, here's your login for the application 123, and here's your login for application ABC. Would you say you have 3 identities or 3 accounts?
I would say I have 3 accounts that map back to my identity, my master record, whatever you want to call it. Incarnation, Ashish, you mentioned, like things like that, is you've got an identity. And then if you think about it as a tree underneath, if you double click an identity, you'll see 3 folders for 3 different accounts.
There's one Jeff Stedman.
Thankfully, the world doesn't need it anymore.
And that's what I think with identity, using the term identity when it comes to, hey, Terraform spins up 500 accounts a day. It doesn't have 500 identities. It doesn't create 500 Jeff Stedmans. It creates 500, accounts that exemplify Jeff Stedman. We're going off the deep end here, and I have a better question. I think it's better. It's more on target because you talked about this is a data problem, and I totally agree, especially when it comes to authorization. I mean, that's the hard problem, right? Is understanding what an account or an identity has access to in total, what it should have access to, which is usage patterns. I mean, you took on this hard problem. Talk to us about why. I mean, to me, it's like it gets down to like exactly what the issue is. It's trying to drive toward some instantiation of least privilege, right?
100%. You can also call it zero trust for identity, right? What is the definition of least privilege? What is the definition of zero trust? To us, at Andromeda, it means that any identity should only have those set of permissions on the standing basis that are frequently used and low risk. And why that matters? That, remember, we said it's not if, it's when you'll get compromised. So when you're compromised, if your attack surface is defined by low risk permissions, then you don't have nothing to worry about, right? And everything else that moves out goes to just-in-time access, which is, again, automated based on context. But to achieve this true zero trust or true least privilege, you have to understand 2 things. You have to understand risk and you have to understand usage. Usage is based on the actual activity that identity is doing, but not just that identity, the peers. So that's where some of the machine learning models come in. Well, if Jeff and Jim are part of the same team, is there a peer behavioral model that can also influence what should be part of standing privilege or not? Because at the end of the day, remember, we are trying to achieve 2 things at the same time: security and agility or productivity. Anytime, especially in cloud and SaaS, if you slow down your developers and users, they're not going to adopt the tool. So we are always trying to strike the balance. And to do that, coming back to your data problem, Jim, if we can analyze the user behavior, the peer behavior, the context, the locations, the devices, the past history, and then combine that with the risks of the permissions. So each of AWS, GCP, Azure have 15, 20,000 individual permissions. They're not equal. There are view level permissions and list level permissions to read, write, and IAM level permissions. can you give her different risk levels, combine that with the usage models, and then derive this zero trust or this least privilege? That's the holy grail, and that's what we are doing at Andromeda based on the data lake. And that's where the machine learning models, the AI models come into play. That's why the hard problem, and that's why it's more exciting.
All right, so I smelled an AI conversation. I knew it was coming. And look, I'm a little bit skeptical because now I start to see a whole bunch of applications and products and vendors, jumping on AI. And I guess help me understand, right? We have AI, and I think of AI now as generative AI, not machine learning, which is also AI, yes, but it's sort of like what I'll call the legacy definition, if you want to call it that. Help me understand, where does AI come into the Andromeda platform? What is it used for? Is it really generative AI? Is it ML or some mix of the two? Help frame that for me from a contextual perspective.
Definitely. Short answer, it's a combination, and it's not AI for the sake of AI. It's not AI washing, right? We are genuinely trying to figure out what is the best way to solve a problem. So to give you an example, right? Once you have all the data in a single data lake, it's a graph-based database. What are the questions we're trying to answer? So first is a risk scoring. So we have a 3-part risk model based on posture. So posture risk, configurations, MFA, etc., key hygiene. Behavioral risk, past activity behavior, applications, logins, locations, etc. And privilege risk, analyzing the riskiness of the permissions and the accesses and so on. So this is where we use some of the machine learning models to define the risk score in the best possible way. Mathematical models, some of them are machine learning models for assigning risk score to every role, every AWS account, every identity, every application, and so on. We also use behavioral machine learning models for looking for anomalies. Anomalies of a given user compared to its past behavior, anomalies of a given user compared to its peers, and so on. And these are well-defined machine learning models, clustering models, anomaly models, and so on. We use models for, so one place we do use generative AI is for summarizing session activity logs. So what we do is, let's say you got a privileged sessions for 2 hours. We look at the activity logs. Let's say it's AWS. We look at the CloudTrail logs of what Jim did in that 2-hour privileged session, every action Jim performed. And then the output of the model is an English language summary saying, Jeff logged in for 2 hours. He did these actions. These were anomalous. These were expected. And here is everything he did. Some things were successful. Something was not successful. That summarization is where we use Gen AI models. But that's a very specific use case. So again, it's the same data lake with the context, with the behavior, with the activity logs. And depending on what we're trying to do, we use different ML and AI models.
So as a customer, can I tune the models in a way to say, okay, here is what I'm looking for, or here is what's risky? I would imagine it takes time to develop whatever the access patterns might look like, right? How do you know if something's risky unless there is an outlier of data, right, for it to pick up on? Right. What is, I guess, first question, how do I tune some of these models to look for what I'm looking for, or make it more fine-tuned for my application or whatever it may be? And then how long does it take, realistically, to establish a baseline of what is normal versus what is not normal?
Great question. Let me start with the second question first. So when we onboard a customer, if the customer has the last 90 days of log data, we use that for baselining. So our current training period is 90 days worth of data, and we can always go longer. And for most cases, customers usually have that 90 days of data in the history. So we can hit the ground running with that 90 days of history immediately, right? If the customer doesn't have any data, then of course you have to wait for 30, 60, 90 days for the baseline to be established. But that's rarely happens. Now, how how we train our models is we don't use customer data to train our models, because the good news is that, especially in cloud and SaaS, these are standard applications and standard behavior where you know what is a risky behavior of a certain permissions and what is not. So we can use generic synthetic data to train our models. And similarly for the Gen AI piece, where we send to the LLM models to translate to an English language, there is no customer data that's being sent, because it's the actions, which are generic AWS or Azure actions, which are getting translated, and the context is getting translated. Nothing that is customer specific, right? So that's a good part. In terms of tuning, there are multiple aspects of the model. So the risk is impacted by the set of permissions, as well as the type of assets. Is it a production environment versus a dev environment? Does it have PII data or not? Those are tunable by customers today, and that impacts the risk score and so on. The other aspects we are in the process of exploring how we can make some of those models more tunable, but that's again based on customers' needs. That should be fairly straightforward for us to do. Now, one of the biggest criteria for us to implement any ML or AI model is explainability. If we cannot explain what the model did in an English language in a reasonable way, then we do not want to put it in the product. We do not want to offer that, right? So explainability is a very, very important consideration when we develop the product. And then finally, no models are perfect. If we say, I'm with 100% probability, I'm telling you this is what the case is, you're fooling yourself, you're fooling the customers. That's not the right thing to do. So in a lot of our recommendations, a lot of our summarizations and analysis, we put up what we call it confidence interval, saying, look, our confidence interval for this analysis is 60 to 80%. Of course, if it's below a certain threshold, we won't even show it. But beyond certain threshold, you can configure and say, start showing me your recommendations and analysis as long as it hits a certain threshold. And then we'll show you what that threshold we have hit, so that you can tune that and say, no, show me only after it's 80%, or show me anything above 50%, and so on, right? And then finally, we take input from the customer saying, this is not true, it's a false positive. So that goes back into the product, right? Because we're trying to strike a balance between false positive and false negative, right? And every customer has a different level of tolerance for that. And that is something you can tune and say, show me, even if you're 50% confident, show me, or show me only after 90%, and so on. And then take the feedback and tune the model again, and so on. Hope that helps.
It does. And I think one last question for me will be, I guess, the security of the AI models themselves. And I think you kind of mentioned is you don't put customer data right into your model, but what are the guidelines or guardrails for what stays, I guess, on-prem or in my specific cloud versus your cloud versus maybe a third-party cloud like an OpenAI or Anthropic or Google or whatever it may be? How do you see those three things mixing, and how do you make sure that data doesn't cross boundaries? Because I feel like that's an area that needs to be explained anytime someone's saying, AI.
No, 100%, right? So I think you outline that framework very well, right? So first of all, from the customer cloud or customer prem, we don't pick any data per se. The only sensitive information we are getting is, of course, user IDs and their emails, because it's an identity product, but none of that data is pulled into Andromeda. All of that, whatever we pull in, stays within Andromeda's cloud environment. We are a SaaS product. And none of that goes into a third party, whether it's OpenAI or Anthropic or any other model, because what we are sending, and again, remember, we're using the LLM models only for a very specific use case, which is session summarization. And if as a customer says, I don't want that feature, no problem. It's a very modular product. So there only the actions are going in saying, some anonymous user X, perform these sequence of operations, translate them to an English language summary for me. So there is no data that's going into a third party. But I think at a larger point, this is a very, very important topic to us. It's very near and dear to us because, as I said earlier, if you can't show the safety and security of our data in the model and can't explain our answers, then we can't build trust in our customers, right? So
Ashish, I wanted to say bravo on the explainability point. I mean, I love that. I've been a voice towards this for a while, which is how could I sit in the witness chair and explain why a decision was made if I can't explain it? Some black box AI decided is not going to be an acceptable answer, in my opinion. So, bravo on that. You talked a lot about models, and I see this trend that's happening in the market, which is you've got a more savvy client. I love the data lake concept. I think the client wants to have a hand in, that data lake, that their data. They want to help design it. They want to say, hey, my business is a certain business, and to us, here's a certain data element that is not important to anybody else in the world. So you haven't figured out this use case. This is specific to me. I want to have my product build that into the risk score, which I'm assuming is part of a model. So my question to you is, like, as a customer, do I have any influence over how that model works, or is it a black box to me?
It's a great question. So I think the answer is in it depends. Where we do have certain tunable parameters that you can influence to adjust the model. Having said that, we will be looking in future where, in your case, as a customer, based on your data, these are the kind of models that might make sense. And maybe you already have developed the model and you are asking, can you use this model for me, for example? That is something that we were looking at potentially in the future. The way we think about this is the following. We cannot be the be-all, end-all of all risk calculations and all threat detection and so on. We build the product with doing some of that on our own and ability to inject external threat signals or external any kind of signals, risk signals into Andromeda, right? So the product is built with that capability. I'll give you a specific example. Let's take an example of an EDR and XDR solution. We are not an XDR solution, but XDR solutions have powerful signals on devices and locations. Can that be inserted into Andromeda? Absolutely. That's something we'll do. Because the ultimate goal, remember, what is our core? Our core is permissions, right sizing, automating permissions and lifecycle, right? So for example, if there is an external threat signal that says this identity is compromised, we can near real time bring all its permissions down to zero and make all the JIT approvals, the privilege access, go through multiple gates. That is the power of Andromeda. That's the ultimate, which is, it's not if, it's when you'll get compromised. But when you're compromised, can you eliminate the attack surface as fast as possible? Yes. And that's where we shine and that's where we differentiate. So I know I answered your question in a couple of different ways, but to summarize, we have some tunable parameters for our risk models. We will enable some more, but we are open to taking additional signals, external signals into Andromeda to make more intelligent decisions. Yes, that's the goal.
I love it. I love it. I love your passion. I think what makes identity companies go to that next level is having somebody like yourself who's passionate and very intelligent and a deep thinker. I wanted to ask two more questions before we take it out. So, one, you mentioned earlier that you set up a landing page, or I'm sorry, Jeff may have mentioned it, Andromeda Security /IDAC. That's where people can go to get more information. What will they find there? What are you going to have as that landing page?
Great question, Jim. So it's an offer for a free discovery, risk scoring, and permissions right sizing. What does that mean? We will, as part of this offer, give you full visibility, full discovery of all your human, that's the relatively easy part, but non-human identities as well, in a single dashboard, give you a 3-part risk of each of those identities so you know which identities are high risk and why. with built-in recommendations and remediation steps, and right-size the roles for you for all of those identities based on its activity pattern and risk. That's the offer.
I love it. I love it. Final question to take you out from the hard part, and then we'll do our lighter note. So you're on the Identity at the Center podcast, and a lot of our guests always wind up and accidentally falls out of people's mouth, because identity is at the center. So when you first heard about our podcast, relate that back to Andromeda Security and your platform, Identity at the Center. What does that mean to you?
No, it's very relevant. I think I mentioned in the top of the podcast, like identity is at the center of security today, because I think depending on which year, 23, 24, 2/3 to 3/4 of all attacks are related to identity one way or the other, right? So especially in cloud and SaaS, when there is no physical perimeter, identity is the perimeter, and your attack surfaces is the list of permissions you have. So it's very, very relevant. So when I heard IDAC for the first time, I said, wow, that's so true. I don't think you started it when identity was the primary attack vector, but that's where we are right now. So
we had plenty of foresight.
Yes.
And luck.
Yeah. No, we knew it. Come on, let's pump ourselves up. It's like we knew it was at the center. We bought the domain name, trademarked it, copyrighted it, all that good stuff. So yes, you're preaching to the choir here. We feel like Identity is the center. That's why we named it the show as it is. All right, Jim mentioned that's the hard part. Now it's the even harder part where we talk about ending on a lighter note, something that is maybe not identity related, or maybe it is, I guess, depending on how you look at it. And we were kind of spitballing ideas on this, and I kind of settled on this idea of books on tape, and that's how old I am. Tape, right? Everything's recorded now, et cetera. And we were kind of talking about a couple of different sci-fi things that we were into and stuff like that. You had a recommendation, so I want to give you an opportunity to sell your recommendation to everyone else, because you sold me on it, and it's in my Audible queue waiting for me for my next flight. And then I'm going to give a recommendation, and then Jim's going to yell at us, from his porch, saying, "Get off my lawn," or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. So before I give my recommendation, I think I got into listening to books when I love reading books, but I don't have time. But where do you have time? When you're commuting. And so that's when I got into the books. And then COVID hit. So when we started working from home, so I had to find time to commute so I can listen to the books, right? But I got into the books a few years ago, and I wanted to do something that's not tech related at all. Still intellectually stimulating, but nothing to do with identity, nothing to do with cloud, nothing to do with tech. And so I got into sci-fi, and the best book I have listened to is The Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. Same author who wrote Martian and a couple other books as well. But I highly recommend that book, not to read, but to listen to. Because if you see, the book has not been read by, it's been performed by. They've actually done a full production in a studio with different accents and different dialects and different sound effects. So highly, highly recommend Project Hail Mary. So that's my recommendation.
You sold me on the performance thing, because I've listened to, several audiobooks, and you're right. They're usually someone reading it, and it's usually one person.
Yeah.
And hey, more power to them. They're trying to do different voices maybe sometimes and things like that. Yeah. It's like, okay. But, if it's a full-on production, sign me up. I mean, and I'm a big sci-fi guy, so, this is kind of right up my alley. It's like, all right, Ashish, you got me. Downloaded. Yep. I'm in. So I had a recommendation for you. Now, it's not produced, like you said. It is definitely someone reading, but I think it does a good job. And I think the story is, at least from my mind, very original at the time I read it several years back, but is becoming, I think, a little more relevant. And it is a series called, they call it Bobiverse, and there's 5 different books, and you can certainly listen to them as well. We Are Legion, We Are Many, and kind of something that, other things like that. And the whole idea is basically AI is sort of at the center of this conversation, but it's a little more human type approach to it. And I don't want to spoil it, because it really does kind of pick up pretty quickly, and then sort of like, there's a lot going on here. But my recommendation is Bobiverse. It's by Dennis E. Taylor. The first in the series is We Are Legion. It is my go-to recommendation for anybody who is a sci-fi junkie, like myself. So hopefully people will check that out. Jim, how about yourself? Do you have any Audible, books on tape, or other recommendations?
So I've had Audible accounts over the years. I am not a sci-fi junkie, and I was reminded of that over the holiday break when I admitted to my son that I've never seen any of the Harry Potter movies. I don't.
Well, I'll admit too, I've never seen one either, and that might shock people, but I've never seen one, and I just don't have the interest either. Lord of the Rings, give me that. I'm all in, but Harry Potter, not my jam.
As you could probably expect, I've never seen any of the Lord of the Rings either. But I mean, this floored my son. And I was surprised he was a Harry Potter junkie. But my overall recommendation is, and you've heard me use this term a lot, Jeff. You need to sharpen the saw. And to me, that's all about getting outside of your normal zone. I remember I had an Audible subscription to Harvard Business Review, and it's dry, it's pretty boring, but it gets you thinking about the way the organization runs, and a lot of articles on strategy. And heck, now what we do is we help our clients build their identity strategy, and being able to align that to the business strategy, I think, is so key. So if you're not staying sharp, you're using old ideas, then you're not going to be able to remain relevant. You can take breaks, a year at a time, 2 years at a time. You start taking 5 year at a time breaks of continuing your education, continuing to sharpen the saw, you're going to be irrelevant very quickly.
You're always sharpening the saw. I need a break. Here's the $1 million idea: is someone should write an engaging story style approach that weaves in some of those things. I know there was one, I can't remember it. It's like an IT book that's pretty famous, and it's escaping my mind right now.
The Phoenix Project or something?
Phoenix Project. I need to see more Phoenix Project style books where it's a story and it's, it's weaving in little parables along the way, that people can kind of get into. Then you sign me up, and then Ashish, we do like a full production of it with like sound effects and, different voice cast and things like that. Like, I need to see more of that in my sharpening the saw.
Yeah. I think there's more money in writing a book like Harry Potter.
Who knows? I mean, you were right. The Identity at the Center audio drama. I mean, that's what we produce basically every week.
Yeah.
All right. Let's go ahead and leave it there for this week. Ashish, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to have a link in our show notes for people to check out Andromeda. It's andromedasecurity.com/IDAC. Take advantage of the offer that Ashish mentioned. I think that sounds pretty awesome. And then I'll have a link also to your LinkedIn profile so people can reach out if they have questions and things like that. But thank you so much for joining us. Any parting thoughts before we wrap this up officially?
No, thank you for having me. This was a fun and engaging conversation, and I'm glad we are all trying to solve the hard identity security problem and having some fun doing that. So, yep, looking forward to more fun coming up.
We try to have fun. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But we'll leave it there for this week. Thank you, everybody, for watching and or listening. You can find us on the web, idacpodcast.com. Reach out, ask questions, engage either on YouTube or podcast or LinkedIn or wherever you find us. We always appreciate that. So with that, thanks, everyone, again, for listening or watching. And we'll talk with you all in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.